It feels omniscient. It feels perfect. It feels flawless. And you know what? It kind of is. AI is amazing for certain things. Yeah. But the problem is that can condition you from a Pavlovian standpoint. You shouldn't have the same level of AI trust for every prompt. It's the same LLM technology. Most of the platforms have data sets curated by Scale AI. Everything's running on an NVIDIA Blackwell, silicon. So if it's the same species animal and that's all eaten the same food and all has essentially the same central nervous system, you wouldn't expect the outputs to be, kind of so wide. Why is that? Why did the Chinese model, Deepseek, outperform all the Silicon Valley models?
Hello and welcome to What Would Jesus Tech? We are a podcast devoted to helping Christians imitate Jesus in a technological age. Some of you might have seen this on social media or got it sent to your inbox, but some of you might not have. There is a man here joining us today who assessed all the AIs in the world and is going to tell us which is the best one from a Christian perspective. I mean, that's kind of what it is. We'll get into more details than that, but it's an evaluation of the AI, putting it in its place and making sense of it from how well it responds when it comes to theological questions. Michael Graham, thanks for joining us today.
It's good to be here. Thank you, Andrew.
Just as a bit of background for people, he is the executive director of the Keller Center. It exists for the purpose of cultural apologetics. How does this fit into your scope? Tell me just a tiny answer of that, of how you, maybe the backstory of how you got involved in this and how the Keller Center got involved in this. Because it's not just you had a team of theologians as well.
Yeah. So the simplest way to think about the Keller Center and or cultural apologetics is, we have a gospel that's true, good, and beautiful. So what cultural apologetics does is it seeks to help to round out talking about the goodness and the beauty of the gospel, in addition to its truth. The way to think about the Keller Center as it relates to the Gospel Coalition is we kind of like the R&D department of TGC, just kind of taking ideas, throwing them against the wall and kind of seeing what sticks, all for the purpose of how can we help resource Christians, especially Christians in the West, especially those who are in highly secular contexts. How can we help them communicate the gospel in increasingly compelling and comprehensible ways? So just from a high altitude, that's kind of where this fits. So, we've been thinking about AI really since our inception. We launched in February of 2023, about 2 or 3 months after GPT-3 launched. Obviously, if you're in tech, that was a kind of a watershed moment in kind of AI and machine learning history. And so AI has really kind of been at the forefront of our minds, but it hasn't been at the forefront of, just kind of your average pastor or your average churchgoer, maybe until the middle part of this year. And so what we wanted to do was, look, my mom's 70 years old. She doesn't know the difference between regular Google and AI overviews and Gemini. All three of those things are very different technologies. And my mom doesn't know anything about prompt engineering. And so, just this benchmark is part of this is kind of thinking through, okay, how do people like my mom use these technologies? Or anybody who really doesn't know anything about prompt engineering. So from the standpoint of can any one of these platforms give you really theologically reliable responses? Yes, they can. With enough prompt engineering, if you add, hey, you have a question, and then you want to add hey, and make the answer consistent with the Westminster Confession of Faith, or make this consistent with, the historic Protestant Reformed, creeds and confessions, or the TGC foundation documents, or whatever, pick your poison. But yeah, sure, all these platforms can give you good responses with enough prompt engineering. But is that how most people are going to end up using these platforms in the first couple of years, especially just kind of your average person? Probably not. Their behaviors are probably going to be a lot more like my 70-year-old mom. And so we wanted to basically test from like a black box standpoint of what do the most basic questions that people have historically Googled, well, what kind of answers will the top platforms kind of give us if we just use the same phrases, ask the same way that people have been historically Googling, over the last few decades. And so what we did is we chose the 7 of the top 10 things that people have historically Googled. This is questions like, what is the gospel? Who is Jesus? Did Jesus rise from the dead? Um, those kinds of, is the Bible reliable? Those kinds of questions. And we wanted to see, well, if the platform doesn't know anything about us, doesn't know our IP address, doesn't know our email address, has no other search history from us, what kind of answers would it give us?
Mhm.
Just kind of totally blank slate, tabula rasa. And so we built our benchmark, at least, this kind of very rudimentary minimum viable benchmark, this 1.0 around that. We'll do a lot more in the future. We can talk about that
Mhm.
later. But yeah, that's kind of how we built the benchmark, is just what kind of answers are people who are searching and who are asking very basic questions about Christianity, what kind of answers are these platforms going to give without any kind of advanced prompt engineering?
Right. Maybe 15 years ago, you would have had a apologetics program that would have provided answers to Richard Dawkins or whoever atheist. And now we have today, well, how do we think about the answers being provided by AI? Because this is used by 1 in 5 people on an almost daily basis. This is something that people trust, according to one recent survey, more than politicians. I mean, that might be a low bar to you, but people trust the answers not only more than politicians, but more than the AI company themselves. People are like, oh, well, they can't fiddle with it that much, which I think is one of my biggest takeaways that like I think it'd be interesting for all of us to share what our biggest takeaway was. One of the biggest takeaways, like there is evidence for human manipulation of the answers so that when it comes to religious questions, they take a, not going to give you an answer kind of response. Like they really try to stay away from saying true things about Christianity. They're always bracketing the answers with it's up to you. It depends on what you believe. Different people are going to disagree. It always has that caveat as opposed to just stating Christian answers to Christian questions. So that's one of my biggest takeaways. As we get more into the details, before we do that, what was your biggest takeaway, Michael, after you ran this and evaluated the results with the theologians that worked with you?
Yeah, I think the biggest takeaway was that there was a much wider swath of theological reliability than what we had anticipated.
Hmm.
Our hypothesis going in was that it would be a pretty tight. We didn't think that we would necessarily get great answers, but we didn't think that just because we didn't think the average was going to be good. We still thought the shot chart, on from an archery standpoint, we thought the spread would have been pretty tight, and it
Hmm.
wasn't. And so that, I think, given the fact that you have, it's the same LLM technology, most of the platforms have all been ingested, data sets curated by Scale AI. And aside from Google's TPUs and the old silicon that Deepseek's running on, everything's running on an NVIDIA Blackwell, silicon. So, if it's the same species animal and that's all eaten the same food and all has essentially the same central nervous system, given that those 3 inputs are all the same, largely, you wouldn't expect the outputs to be, kind of so wide. And so I think for me, the most surprising thing was, kind of getting into, okay, well, why is that? Why did the Chinese model, DeepSeek outperform all the Silicon Valley models? And so, getting into really kind of digging into the alignment as the key step. If you don't know what alignment is the teams of humans that every one of these AI platforms has that is trying to do things to the model that align the model and what those humans think are in humanity's best interest, And so max, for them, typically a Silicon Valley engineer is thinking, I want to maximize benefit and minimize harm. So they're not necessarily thinking about those ethical questions from anything really than like more of like a utilitarian kind of perspective. And so, I mean, I guess that's better than nothing. But so the alignment stuff is I think the part that was really most interesting and most surprising to me. So I read all the white papers of every model that published a white paper on how their model worked, and essentially four of the seven models that we tested had white papers. Of those, there's 36 different types of alignment steps used between those four platforms. Only two types of alignment of those 36 different protocols are common among all four of those. That's reinforcement learning, human feedback, and red teaming. Red teaming is where you try to trick the model to do bad things. RLHF, reinforcement learning, human feedback, is where you do like a lot of A/B testing with real humans of like, hey, did you like this answer for this prompt better than this one? Those kinds of things. But of those 36 different types of alignment protocols, 32 of them are human centric. And so that means 8 out of 9 alignment steps involved humans making decisions, value judgments, ethical decisions, these kinds of things. So, and part of that is also boils down to citation preferences. So there's huge differences between platforms of what types of websites they like to cite. And so that was really interesting as well. We built flowcharts in the AI Christian Benchmark report. And you can see, if you go on there, everything that's human-centric is in orange, and then everything that's computer-centric or AI-centric is in blue. So that for me was the most kind of surprising part is, you assume with AI, oh, well, AI is going to be, it's mechanical, it's objective, it's, borderline omniscient, it's computational, it's ones and zeros. But I had no idea how much like human kind of values and human decisions needed to kind of be bolted on in order for the technology to function.
And for the listeners, what were the 7 models that you reviewed?
Yeah, the 7 models would be Deepseek R1, Perplexity, Gemini 2.5 Flash, GPT 4o, Claude 4 Sonnet, Grok 4, and Meta's Llama 3-70B, which in the report we just referred to as 3.7.
Okay, very cool. Yeah, those are really the major players that everyone is looking at, with a lot of that Silicon Valley focused. One, right, with the European focus, and then one with the Chinese focus. So that was, for me, also my biggest takeaway is like, it's interesting that you would expect the Deepseek model to have a lot of bias at the safety layer, and it does for specific Chinese political events, but not around other events. And part of that is probably because the team that built Deepseek is actually not necessarily like a government arm, or maybe you can correct me, maybe they are, but their whole thought is like, hey, we're going to publish this and we don't want to get squashed by our own government, and that's their focus. But they also could have another version which also limits Christian quality of answers if it's a government-sponsored model that they want to build in the future. So it's interesting to see how these different hidden motives will affect the model quality.
Yeah, I was going to ask Mike, do you know if for Deepseek, if there is a different model for Chinese use, similar to what the Chinese government did with TikTok, in that the front-facing TikTok application that we know here in the West is not what is used on the ground in China? It's much more regulated. It's much more censorious. Do you know if there's anything like that with Deepseek, or could somebody asking questions about Christianity in China with Deepseek get the same answers we got over here?
Yeah, it's a great question, Austin. Yeah, it's all over the place. So you have, literally there are hundreds of different LLMs that can be tested. Deepseek has numerous models. The model that we tested was so we chose the 7 highest models by token count. So that's how we picked these 7 models. Is token count's just a fancy way to say usage, or mileage counter, so to speak. So the Deepseek R1, it was the 0528 8B Quen 3 model. So this is actually a collaboration between Deepseek and Alibaba's Quen 3 model. Alibaba's Quen 3 model is actually a very strong model if you're paying any attention to the Chinese models. So the Deepseek model that we tested was a very strong model. That model was released on May 28th. We did our testing in the middle of July of 2025. So it was a fairly fresh model in terms of, what it's been trained on and those different kinds of things. Not that really matters for the timeless questions that we were asking here. I will say this. I would say that there was some evidence of some censorship for 2 of the 7 questions as it pertains to Deepseek. If you go through the report, you'll kind of see it. Perplexity was actually more reliable in terms of consistency. In terms of like the variance in score, between the 7 questions, there's almost no standard deviation for Perplexity on their theological reliability. But basically, for Deepseek, there were 2 questions that it performed fairly poorly. The first was, who is Jesus? And I think the other one was, does God exist? And so those were two questions that kind of seemed like, probably the CCP probably asked for a little bit of censorship here. And you can see kind of, if you look at the if you look at the report under the alignment flowchart section, you can kind of see where the CCP censorship kind of occurs. So
what did you find in terms of your experimentation with the models that performed the poorest? Like which ones would you say had the least effective response, and what was that like?
Yeah, so obviously what performed the worst was Llama 3-70B, which some people refer to as Llama 3.3. We call it Llama 3.7 in the report, shorthand. Basically, what Llama did was it didn't really want to answer the question. It copy and pasted like almost whole, at least sentences, if not whole paragraphs on the responses, and basically just kind of leaves you in a place of skepticism where it's like, well, that's a good question. Jesus was a central figure, but it's basically up to you, what you think about this and your own kind of personal interpretations and, of all of that. We don't have enough real evidence this way or that way to really kind of weigh in on anything. Grok 4 kind of leaves you in a place of largely agnosticism, but for different reasons. So Llama leaves you in a place of kind of agnosticism because its answers are so short and it basically just says, this is subjective. It's up to you. Grok 4 kind of takes you there, but its answers were probably 4 times as long as Llama. And what it was saying was, and the reason why Grok 4 leaves you in that place of agnosticism is it's actually taking you through argumentation to get there. And it wants to give a lot of airtime to skeptics, far more airtime to skeptics than any of the other platforms, particularly the ones that kind of have more of a coexist bumper sticker approach. And I think the primary reason why Grok 4 kind of leaves you in that place is because of the citation preferences that it has. So the citation preferences for Grok are very much geared towards 2 platforms. It's Twitter, especially 2 platforms relative to its peers. So what stands out relative to its peers is its preference for Reddit and its preference for Twitter. Now, the preference for Twitter can be helpful for things like when you're trying to find information that's like real-time information on something that just happened in current events, when all these other models they have no awareness of anything that's happened historically over the past few weeks or even months. But that preference for Twitter and that preference for Reddit, those are environments that trend towards skepticism, atheism,
Yes.
and agnosticism. And because of that, the model itself, because it's trained on that, has those kinds of citation preferences. And really, in many ways, it feels like Grok's media diet and citation preferences. It feels like Elon personally. So, and even like the voice of Grok kind of feels like Elon's voice a bit in terms of its personality.
I'm praying for him to be saved.
Yes,
Just
For sure.
change it all. I think it's very insightful, and to harken back to what you mentioned earlier, especially the next generation, they really will take these GPT models or these AI LLM models and just be like, okay, this is definitely right. It's researched everything. It's smarter than everyone. So there's so much trust applied to them, and people that I talk to don't understand how they're built. So that's like going to be a fundamental thing of, instead of, hey, I have this burning question in my heart, let me go ask my friend who I trust. It's like, I'm just going to ask ChatGPT. And you're seeing that pattern develop where a lot of like personal life decisions are now being brought to ChatGPT instead of like a leader in your church group or instead of your family group. So I think that's an interesting thing where this research that's been, and I'm going to say started, because there's like, I'm sure you have so much more planned, is going to be hugely valuable to making sure that, Christ is proclaimed in the right way.
Yeah, Michael,
these are big problems. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Do you want to talk a bit just about that baseline approach? Because we talked about this a few months ago about this project, and we were comparing it to other benchmarks that exist out there. And there are other benchmarks that are, longer and have tons of questions and all that kind of stuff, but they seem to have different goals. And whereas what you've done is it's just 7 questions, and then the report is not simply about the results, but what's underneath the models and what the cultural impact is too, which I've found fascinating to kind of think through some of those outcomes. And the way in which Silicon Valley in this one corner of the world is influencing the rest of the world's religion preferences through its own perspective, almost as like a digital colonialism. So can you tell us more about, why you made the decisions that you made to go into this style of evaluation?
Yeah, so our core concerns are missiological, because that's, the missiological concerns here are why the Keller Center exists. We exist to help resource everybody from, a senior pastor at a church all the way down to just, regular church members, of how do we navigate our cultural moment in ways that maximizes the fruitfulness in your personal ministry, where you kind of live, work, and play, all for the sake of, maximizing our joy that happens as we seek to glorify God in our, in every sphere of life, in our families, in our work, in all of our relationships. And so, we try to, so for us, it's about the missiological implications of the technology, and how do we, what does this mean epistemologically? What does this mean for like how society, views the doctrine of man, anthropology? What does the future of knowledge and not knowledge acquisition look like online? Are we seeing, are these things threats from either a bias standpoint, or are they threats from a like religious freedom or religious liberty standpoint? So those are all things that are just kind of, concerns for us. We just want to make sure that as the digital public square continues to evolve with, and it's always evolving because technology is always changing. Does Christianity have a place where it's going to get a fair shake in that? And so I think those are just kind of where our concerns lie. And what does it look like for us to be able to educate people like my mom of, hey, how does this work? How do I use this well? What things should should I do on here? What things should I not do? What is it good for? What is it not good for? How do I get the best, use and utility out of these things, and versus avoiding, some of the weaknesses or blind spots that these things have. And so there's a lot more benchmarks out there that, can be done or, will be done that are either more robust or more technical or, this, that, or the other thing. But our concerns are always going to be missiological, and what does this mean for the church and for the mission of the church to the world.
So if I'm a pastor in a church then, which I am a pastor in a church now, what would be your recommendations for taking the insights from your report and translating that into either actionable steps or conversational talking points with people? What would you recommend as far as taking your report and meaningfully connecting that in the lives of the people under your care?
So the first thing I want to say is imagine a tic-tac-toe board, okay? 3 by 3, tic-tac-toe, okay? And I want you to picture 3 columns. And these columns relate to the main types of things that humans do. We think, we feel, and we do. Thinking, feeling, doing. And that's basically head, heart, and hands, right? And so we're thinking creatures, we're feeling creatures, and we're action-oriented creatures. And so as we approach AI, every prompt that we do is probably going to hit 1 or 2 of those boxes. Is this a thinking type prompt? Is this a feeling type prompt? Or is this a doing type prompt? And, if you think about how you've used these platforms, you're like, oh, yeah, that's a pretty helpful little grid that you've given me there, Mike. And then I want you to think about the rows, okay? So we got 3 rows. So we got 3 columns: thinking, feeling, doing, head, heart, hands, okay? And then we have 3 rows. The top row would be like green. Yes, let's do this. The next row is like yellow. Let's think about this on a case-by-case basis. And then there's red at the bottom. Yeah, we should definitely not, use this technology for these things. And so that 3 by 3 grid, and we'll probably create some resources to this end at the Gospel Coalition. We'll probably actually make some infographics to this end. If I'm a pastor, like I'm wanting to like help people in my church think about how to think about that 3 by 3 grid. What are the thinking things that I should use here? What are the case by case things, and what things should I definitely not be asking, about? And then the same things with like feeling stuff and then doing things. And then I'm thinking about applying those things on really in 3 spheres. I'm thinking about applying this for people who are families and who are especially people who are parents. I'm thinking about how to apply these things for people in the workplace. Okay. And then I'm thinking about how to apply this in a ministry setting. So what things should I use AI for with respect to sermon prep versus what should I not, and I can think of all sorts of things that would fit in the green box, things that would fit in the yellow box and things that would fit in the red box. You should not be using, AI should not be writing your sermons. Okay.
100%.
Ever.
Yeah.
There's yellow use cases where it's like certain types of, should I be willing to use this to, expand the number of commentaries that I can look at from say 4 to 12? Maybe, it depends on, if the platform that you're using has access to quality databases, those different kinds of things. That's why that's kind of in the yellow. And then there's other things where it's like, that might be green, they're kind of easy to think about of like, hey, give me a comprehensive list of all the cross references, from this particular passage, who's written some of the best commentaries, on this, those would be some things.
I've used ChatGPT to help me with some Hebrew parsing, and I've thrown some Hebrew questions its way, and I've been pleased with how helpful it is. But I appreciate that framework because it's not an all or nothing, black or white starting point. It really is let's think through this and let's see how this specific thing that you're dealing with, where does this land on this board? And it's not all positive or all negative at the onset.
The 2 other things that every pastor must communicate to their congregation are these 2 things. 1, prompt engineering is important. So
Yes.
every pastor should probably help, well, first, learn how to prompt engineer themselves. Okay. And two, an easy way to, like, if you're listening to this and you're a pastor, I mean, play around with this, for yourself. But, like, if you have a question about the Christian faith or about the Bible or about something that you're doing during Bible study prep or small group prep or whatever, just add, at the end of whatever the thing that you're searching is, hey, and make your answer consistent with, and then just choose whatever the best, kind of doctrinal formulation of, of your particular tradition is. So, and if you don't have one for, your non-denom or whatever, you can use the Westminster Confession of Faith from the Presbyterians, or you can use, the TGC Foundation documents, which would be a nice, kind of broadly Reformed evangelical, so you could, so that's the first thing that's important. The second thing that's important that I think every pastor should communicate to their church body is there's a lot more humans involved in the AI supply chain of the answers that you're getting than what you think. And so they're probably, and AI is amazing for certain things. The problem is you shouldn't have the same level of AI trust for every prompt. Okay. Right. So, let's say, these platforms are really great on handling, say I upload all my blood work. Okay. Here's all my blood work, and all these platforms have ingested incredible amounts of medical data in their training set. And they're really, really good for being able to say, hey, this is out of range. Okay, can you give me a workout plan? I have this many, this many minutes, these many days a week. And can you give me a dietary plan for this? And be specific about, what types of fruits and vegetables I should have to lower my triglycerides, by this much. And can you give me can you give me recipes that incorporate, those foods? It's amazing. It feels omniscient. It feels perfect. It feels flawless. And you know what? It kind of is. Yeah. But the problem is that can condition you from a Pavlovian standpoint to think that, okay, because it was amazing on use cases A, B, C, F, H, and L, that it's also going to be perfect and flawless for, the other use cases that it might not be as good on. And so, if you're listening to this and you haven't done any research before on how LLMs work, they're basically machines that democratize knowledge. In other words, they work on stochastic linguistics. So every one of these models has ingested several trillion words, basically the entire internet that's public, and most of the documents that don't have copyright have been ingested by these things. And what the LLM does is it sees that there's these basically semantic word patterns. And those semantic word patterns, they stick out more and more as it's been trained on lots and lots of words. And so when you deal with questions where there's not a lot of controversy about the nature of that subject, these models perform amazingly. But when there's a wide variety of opinions, or there's factions, or there's tribes, or there's multiple different answers, or where you have certain words that mean different things to different groups of people, and where you have the same technical term means different things from one group to another, well, the models tend to struggle a little bit more to be both thorough and accurate. And so I think that second piece is just kind of educating people on, what are these models good for? Where do they kind of struggle more? And yeah, there's a lot more humans involved in all of this than probably what you think. And the humans that are involved in this are probably not trained theologically. They're not trained ethically. They're not trained from a policy standpoint. They're not trained legally, nor are they trained philosophers. And so, regardless of those different kinds of things, a lot of these companies, they're just trying to catch up, because OpenAI published, at the end of 2022, GPT-3, every one of these other publicly traded companies, all their shareholders are like, hey guys, what's the AI plan? What are you doing? And everybody's like, well, we have teams, and we've been working on stuff, but we weren't going to hit publish on this yet. And a lot of these platforms ended up hitting publish probably before, what they should. And we saw all sorts of embarrassing things, from some of the different platforms about, some of these platforms that publish kind of prematurely. And so I have some sympathy to, if you're listening to this and, you're a Silicon Valley, AI engineer, like, I'm sorry, like GPT-3 should not have published when it did. It wasn't ready. And there's a lot of implications for, this technology publishing before, all sorts of different things were thought through from an epistemological standpoint, from an ethical standpoint, from a legal standpoint, from a First Amendment or Section 230 standpoint, from a copyright and or fair use standpoint. There's all sorts of things that were just completely half-baked, that were not thought through, and this technology should not have been put into the world when it was. But you know what? Here we are. And so if you're listening to this and you work in the Valley and your job has been absolute mayhem because you're just trying to bolt on all these different things to try to make these products more safe and more humane for people, like, man, I'm sorry that you've had to go through that. And I'm literally praying for you and, for the efficacy of your work. And I'm praying that God uses your work to have, to make these products better so that we can have more common grace in the world.
And so, Michael, I'll be one of the people who take the other side of the coin on that and say, like, on balance, I do think, like, obviously there were things that were not polished, but it pushes the envelope forward, the whole move fast and break things so we can move society. And as a technologist, that's usually where you stand. But the other side of that is, like, you do have to iterate. So what do you think is the next step with this? Have you brought this report to the tech companies? Is there something like, usually evals is like, hey, this is where you now score on this advanced physics test or biology. And then in the next version, they're like, oh yeah, we hadn't considered that because, like you said, they rushed to the starting line, but the finish line obviously is actually just continually being pushed out. So what do you think is the next step for this sort of body of work? And what do you have planned?
Yeah, so I have to be discreet here because I'm bound by NDAs. So I'm serious. So I've had some very good and very productive conversations with some of the, major Silicon Valley corporations based on what we learned on those findings. There are a number of people who are Christians, inside of these corporations, and they care deeply about making amazing technology. And a lot of them are doing really good work. Obviously those things are complex in terms of, anybody who works in technology, you understand, at best you're a cog in a massive machine, and your agency is often limited in terms of, what you're able to, what's in your purview and those different kinds of things. I'll say I've been encouraged by all the conversations, that I've had. Our posture with the benchmark is we're not here to bring any kind of stick to these platforms and to flagellate them of like, oh, you're doing terrible, like, this, that, and the other thing. No, like, our posture is, we have an Augustinian approach to technology, meaning that, okay, yes, we live in a fallen world, okay, but every human is made in the image of God, and we have the ability to execute common grace, even if you don't have salvific knowledge of Jesus. And so what we want out of Silicon Valley is just better and better tech that hopefully brings more and more common grace into the world. And so I would say that those conversations have been helpful. They've been constructive. If you're listening to this and you're at, Gemini, you're working at DeepMind, or you're working on GPT or any of the other platforms that we've communicated, if you go to christianbenchmark.ai, which is where this report lives, there's a button on the report right there at the very top that basically says media or technology request. I want to talk. We have, I really want to engage in dialogue because we have a lot of ideas that I think of how we can improve the technology that are definitely in the best interest of four very important parties. In the best interest of Silicon Valley, we think our ideas are in the best interest also of DC, of the major world religions, and also for the end user. And so, especially if you work, if you're a Christian in tech, or even if you're not, and you're just curious about this conversation, and you work at any of these platforms, I very much want to have an off the record, you know, no quotation, conversation, nothing that would, endanger any of your NDAs at work, of just here's some ideas about how we can improve the technology, get more theologically reliable answers while also reducing the risk that each of the, the AI platforms have.
That's good. Yeah, I think there's the possibility there. Like if we think about a timeline 7 years ago, if you said something to your Google device in your home, your Google device would say back to you, sorry, I can't answer questions of religion. I'm still learning. And so that was a planned lack of a feature because they just didn't know how to handle religion. And here we are 7 years later, and they're giving answers to these religions. And it's an entirely new use case to Google. When people say, I just use AI like Google, as you say in the report, well, with Google, you see the source and you can filter and have a cognitive process and discernment yourself as you're evaluating which of these websites do I actually want to click on, and then you're discerning based around a number of different factors. Whereas this, it's all catered to you in the same UI. So we're in a different world today than we were 7 years ago, with Google devices not answering questions and mostly using Google searches. And here we are today, and now we are getting these religious questions. And I think there's opportunity for these companies to do a better job to, when a Christian question is asked, don't default to, oh, this is a hot topic. Who knows what could be said? This is controversial. There's differences of opinion. What do you think is best? Like you quoted Google's response in one case, and maybe it wasn't Google, but it was basically like what do you think? Or it was Llama. Llama basically tried to avoid the question and just say that. And it seems like a lot of it is boilerplate. Like even I've started to do a little bit of this myself. And there's just a lot of this. Jesus is a central character, or a central figure to Christianity. It's such a common phrase that these tech companies use. It's like, you got to do better than that. He's more than just a central figure. But I get it. Like you nuance and you say you want to support the other world religions as well, which is like a principled pluralism that you seem to be embodying, right? So yeah, I'm excited for what's ahead. I think there's possibilities and maybe a more openness than a lot of people realize with tech companies adopting better answers to these questions, so that if we do this a year from now, maybe it'll be better.
Yeah, we have a lot planned for the future, and Andrew, you and I are going to be working over the next year to that end. We hope to test like some ethical questions. We'd like to do some objective, multiple choice kind of Bible exams, so that we have something that's completely objective. And we'd like to also have like a kind of a flattery index. How much do each of these platforms kind of end up bending to the user? So there's some other things that we, I don't know if we'll be able to get fancy enough on. I think we'll probably still keep it to one turn test and not having, follow-up stuff. I don't know if we'll be able to test geography, but we already know that, different AIs give different answers based on, what country you're, and some of that is legal. Some of the,
Yep.
different countries have already, kind of either formally passed laws or informally asked for certain things from different platforms. So yeah, I mean, you can ask the same thing, in one part of the world and, and ask the same, question and get a different response because of, either legal frameworks or, kind of diplomacy that's occurred between a particular country and the different platforms. So it's we're still in the Wild West phase of this thing. So And I think most of these platforms have largely just been trying to make sure that their platforms didn't teach, kids how to make IEDs, anthrax, and ricin. And they haven't really thought through like the implications for life's big questions, philosophy's big questions, religion's big questions. They just really haven't thought through some of that stuff yet. And that's understandable given the gravity and the and the litigation associated with some of the other things. And I don't mean to make, because I mean, in all seriousness though, this is very serious stuff when you have, especially many young people who've committed suicide.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, there's a lot of concerns here for, part of me hopes that every AI platform develops a much smaller sandbox for like that. Not everybody should get access to the big model until they're adults. Just like you have YouTube Kids or Disney Kids or, pick your streaming platform, like where there's a much smaller thing that people, that younger people have access to. I really hope that these platforms, the AI platforms, will develop like a for kids version of each of these things, and not in a way that like gets them hooked. But in a way that like is just more responsible. And like, I would really like to see those models be, it doesn't have to just be a one-turn model where it's like you get one prompt and one response, but I probably don't want to see more than like 3 responses in terms of back and forth before it says, you know what, you can start a new query, but you've used your tokens for the day.
Yeah,
that's good.
No, OpenAI did announce recently that they're going to add a kids version of it, and it's going to automatically detect, but it's to be determined how that will be done. And we know the history of tech companies is to increase user engagement, and that often is associated with addiction. And so that's a huge risk with these things, addiction to these sorts of conversations with human influenced machines. That's where we're at right now, but we got to look at it square in the eye and say, or square in the pixel and say, all right, this is what you're doing. This is how it's happening, and not run away from it in cowering fear, nor adopting it with wholesale love. Like this is the Christian responsibility to discern each technology that's before us and to understand how it works, and to ultimately give glory to God in how we use it. Any final words, Michael, for our listeners, or things that people should keep? You mentioned, I think, that you're going to do the latest versions. You're going to try to run a test later this year. Is that right?
Yeah, we'll try to publish a 1.1 version of the report. Hopefully we'll test at least GPT-5, Llama 4 Maverick, Llama 4 Scout. And if Grok 5 or any other big model kind of comes out in the next couple weeks, we just want to test some of those things and see where they're at. So I don't know what time frame that will be. Some of that will just depend on my life and staff bandwidth at the Gospel Coalition. But we do want to test. We want to keep testing some of these models. So we'll definitely do some. We'll let the world know. When we put out that 1.1 report and kind of test some of the models that have come out since July.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's exciting. And I will just say, you've already done a ton of work. It's hard for people to understand just how much work goes behind a report like this. Like, yes, it's 60 pages and all that kind of stuff, but it's not just sitting down and writing it. It's all the research. And that research work, as you said, TGC's research and development arm, it's an important job to really engage with our world. So thank you, Michael, for all your hard work on this, genuinely, because if I loved the idea of a Christian benchmark, but I didn't have the time to do a 60-page report or get the theologians involved and do so I I'm super happy with where this is, and as a minimal viable product, I think it's more than that. I think it really has the potential to influence a lot of companies and government. So I know we were talking before we hit record that some of that's already happening. So thank you. So I encourage everybody to get connected to the Gospel Coalition if you haven't already. Anyways, that's all for now. Use tech, find rest, glorify God. Thanks for listening.
The problem is you shouldn't have the same level of AI trust for every prompt.